as a filmmaker, it was the first time that I asked the subject to come on this adventure. And you know, I knew that I needed to trust the person if I was going to ask them to go the right time. And with Bethann, I really felt that, you know, we were going to have a conversation. It was going to be a productive conversation because we've known each other for like almost 10 years now. When Bethann got the CFDA award, which you see in the film, somebody approached me to make a short film, a 3-minute short film to introduce her on stage. And that was my first introduction. I didn't actually know who Bethann was beforehand, because I'm not so much in the fashion world, and I was like blown away. I was like, who is this person? It's incredible, the way she tells stories. And so I interviewed her for like several hours, and just for this 3-minute thing, I probably interviewed her for like 5 hours. We couldn't stop. And then we started talking about Invisible Beauty, the feature film that she had actually started. Well, she had started, it was a different film. It was more about the industry, and it was an activist film that was following 3 models in the industry, and she was trying to change things and expose the industry. And she managed to change things without the film being completed, and so the film went dormant. And then we started talking about making the film about her, which, you know, I certainly believed that was the way to go, and like a lot of other people in her life were telling her, you know, that she was the story.
So tell me, it's unusual for the subject of a film to also co-direct the film, right? So tell us a little bit about the process and how that, like, who has the final say? How's that work?
So, yeah, it is very unusual, and, you know, I was looking for something a little deeper, a different way to make films, because I feel like with subjects, sometimes there's a lot of, you know, there's a hierarchy of power. There's a power dynamic between the subject and the filmmaker, and each one's trying to protect, you know, their interests, and I wanted to change the game, especially in the context of representation and what Bethann is fighting for. I wanted her to feel comfortable to tell her story, and so I was looking at ways to collaborate, and I asked her. We had been talking for several months about doing this film, and I was like, okay, I'll do it. I'm clearing my schedule, but I want you to do it with me. And that really changed the dynamic in a way that I wanted. It really made us like really kind of locked in every decision. And we had a rule, like, to answer your last question about who has final say. Like, I told Bethann, I was like, well, you know, we're going to disagree at some point, but I want us to be, you know, always willing to convince the other person so that we get to an agreement. We talk it out until we're both happy with it. And we actually didn't really have to use that rule. I mean, it was like a minor, I mean, we never really had like a big fight or anything. It was just like sometimes there were people that Bethann wanted me to interview, and I was really focused on the story and how I was going to tell the story, and so I didn't see how they fit. And we talked it out.
Okay, so in the film we see Kadeem, her son, talk about how honest she is, right? And if you're not willing or you're not ready to hear the truth, right, that she's not the person to call. I mean, you're painting a very nice picture, and thank you, but I also want to know, like, what was your biggest disagreement? I can imagine that there were some truths that she may have told you in the creative process, right?
No, I mean, honestly, she was very respectful, and, you know, like, I think we both kind of stepped up to be the best version of ourselves because we really wanted to make the other one proud. That's kind of the dynamic that got installed. So Bethann was very respectful. She knew, like, that I was a filmmaker with experience, so she needed to trust me on certain things. And then I was constantly on the phone to try to understand the story. I mean, especially, you know, in the summer of 2020, after George Floyd was killed, it was really important for me to understand how she felt and her point of view and the long lens of history that she's experienced. And so, you know, there was never a disagreement. There were like things that we had to correct. Like, you know, I would assume that her life was about this, and then she would be, well, actually no, you know, like this is it and that, and like, but that's because we're on the phone all the time, like, you know, several times a week for hours, and those phone calls end up in the film. But you're right that she tells the truth, and that made, like, I was really nervous when I showed her a cut for the first time, because I knew, like Kadeem says, like, you know, if she's not impressed, she's not impressed. She's not going to pretend, you know, and I'm going to know immediately. And so I worked really hard with our editor, and I didn't show her the first cut, which was 7 hours long. It was too long. It was too much footage.
7 hours.
7 hours. Yeah, that's how
she watched 7 hours.
No, we cut it down to 4, and that's what I showed Bethann. And we did actually. We did 2 screenings, and we met at the end on Zoom with our producer Lisa and our editor. And I was really surprised because I was nervous. I was really just not sleeping anymore at that point. And I could tell immediately that she was actually discovering her life story and that she was moved. I mean, she said, like, you made me a believer. I never thought I had a story. And the way you've put it together and what everyone's saying, like, I could see now that I have a story to tell. And so for me, it was like almost like, I mean, it was still 4 hours long, but it was half of the mission was accomplished. You know?
And we're going to open it up if anybody has questions. We have 2 minutes here. And before we do that, though, I'm interested to know, you go from 7 hours to 4 hours to almost 2. How did you what's that process of getting it down, like, in terms of shaping the story and knowing what stays and knowing what goes?
I mean, everything that was not directly Bethann's story had to go, because we had like so many great characters. Tyson, you know, his story alone was like, you know, twice the size. Iman, same thing, you know, like every person in the film had like a very interesting story, and I think in the 4 hours, 7 hours, there was a lot of that. And also there were things, like there were scenes that we had to cut that I loved so much, but you know, in the end, you really have to tell a story, and you can't put the audience through too much. Like, for example, Bethann got tested positive for COVID at some point, and she called me, and she had the most amazing reaction, because she was really, I could tell she was tense and she was a little scared of what the consequences were, but she told me she was dancing salsa every day just to make sure she had the energy. And I was like, oh, you need to film that. And so she filmed it in her hotel room. She was filming a TV show. And
you have that footage.
And we have that footage. You see it in the film, actually. We kept
towards
it
the end.
Towards the end, and she's like dancing.
Yeah.
But before, it was a full-on scene, and you know, and it was very moving to me just to see how she dealt with it. But you know, it was just a little too much, I think, in terms of you know, we had to be light with the theme of her aging and mortality, and I think it's also, she didn't get very sick, so it's like, it was like a false expectation to put the audience through, you know.
Yes, we have a question. No? Yeah, okay.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
Is this on?
Yes. Oh, okay. My question is in regards to your use of color versus black and white. And I want to know what the formula was. I was trying to figure it out, but I couldn't quite. And also, are you considering taking the 7 hours and maybe making this into a series, maybe a 3-part series? How you get that? You got it to 3 parts.
A 7-part series. No, we tried. I mean, we tried at the beginning when we showed the 4 hours. Like, Bethann wanted to make it a series, and we got shut down pretty quickly. I mean, we had like investors and people who expected a feature, you know. And with regards to the black and white versus color, I have to say it was like very much a gut instinct decision in the beginning, because I inherited a lot of footage from the first part of the project when Bethann was photoing 3 models. And it was like early 2000, I mean late 2000, HD, like very saturated colors. It didn't really fit into the film, and also I wanted to make sure it felt like the past, archival, and also there was a starkness. I mean, I just tried one day. I was like, I'm just going to make it black and white because I had just watched Time, Gary Bradley's film, which is in black and white. She's very sublime, and suddenly like Naomi Campbell looked amazing. Bethann looked amazing. All the footage that I thought looked a little awkward suddenly looked beautiful. So I kept it, and in retrospect, I sort of justified it by, it is a period of intense contrast, whitewash, and so the film sort of switches to that color, and then when Bethann gets her award, and it marks the end of that period where suddenly the fashion world is like moving forward.
Other questions? And while we're looking for another question, I have a question. It's making me think of the creative process, right? So you have all of this footage, like what the film is made now, so what happens to all the footage?
Well, I mean, we're going to find a home for it. I mean, Bethann's archives need to be somewhere, in an institution that's going to take care of it. So I think she's working on that. She's aware that actually that was supposed to be a part of the film story. Like besides writing the book, she was also trying to find a place for her archives, but she got so busy with the book and the film that that hasn't developed as much. But it's coming.
I was going to say with like documentary work and keeping the integrity of like what people say, but also everybody in this is very passionate about Bethann's story, and it's really obvious. So like, what were you telling yourself, like narratively speaking, this is what I want to be conveyed, that kind of helped, I guess, be able to not mince, but be able to cut those words up in order to fit that specific narrative you wanted to say? What was your reminder while you're searching through all of this to find these specific points that are hitting this story beat that you think is important?
Well, thank you for your question. I mean, it's a really good question. I don't think there's there's never a preconceived idea about what the story is. I do write a little bit, and for example, the opening scene where I'm talking to Bethann about how the film starts, I actually wrote that before we even talked about it. But when it comes to like people's testimonials and Bethann's story, like I try to come at it from first a listening point of view, just like really listening to what people are saying, and trying not trying to put it in the box of a story. If what they're saying is more complex than, let's say, the straight line that I was envisioning, then I have to change my plan, and I have to somehow make this complexity, understandable for an audience. That's my job.
Any other questions? Was there anything deliberate about the timing of the film? Like, you talk about how long the process has been and what it was before. Was there anything, like, why now?
Why now? Well, I think it was, Bethann always says, like, things come in their own time, like, she really believes in that. And I think it did for both of us, like, in terms of Bethann being in that moment where she's writing the book, and she is ready to look back, because as she says in the beginning of the film, she doesn't really look back, she's just kind of always moving forward. But the book, was a good excuse to do that, and I was lucky to come around that time. And for me, in my personal journey as a filmmaker, it was the right moment too. Like, I think I wouldn't have been able to do it like 10 years ago. I wouldn't have been kind of mature enough to understand how to tell that kind of story.
I think the timing is brilliant. I will say that she and I have the same editor, so I'm going to take that as a sign for myself. But don't you think, marketing-wise, like, don't you want to read her book now? Yeah. We have another. Yes.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, actually, perfect timing again, because I was going to ask about that, the interplay between the book and the documentary, and I can see it in the movie, especially because she mentions that she's going to make the book about people, and I noticed that you highlighted a lot of people in the documentary. I was just curious about the interplay between the book and the documentary, and how they were like different, and how you kind of extracted what she was working on to put it in the documentary and make it its own.
They're going to be very different. Bethann always says that. I've been lucky to read a few pages because I asked her, I was insistent in the beginning. I was like, I really want to read it. And I think I was one of the first people. And she was talking about having a ghostwriter, things like that. I was like, you don't need a ghostwriter. You have an incredible voice. Like it's very Bethann, and her writing style is like very unique. So, but the book is going to be very different, much more wide-ranging than the film. I think that's one of the things that I've learned from Bethann is like she always corrects me when people say, or when I say, I did it a little bit in the beginning. It's like, this is a movie about Bethann's life. She says, no, it's not a movie about my life. It's a movie about my story. She makes the distinction. This is a story we're telling that has to do with her fight for diversity, and so. Maybe to go back to your question, that's the through line that we were kind of telling, and I think the book is going to be about anything. There might be a page about Andy Warhol, there might be a page about this and that, but it doesn't have to tell that story in chronological order. So I think it's going to be. I'm very excited, and she's getting back to it now. I think this month. Because the film has been making her so busy, but by the end of the year, I think she'll be finished.
Any other questions? You have a question in the back? Yeah, one and then we'll probably never pick this
up. With this type of story, were there lines that you couldn't cross, or you weren't allowed to? Subjects that you weren't allowed to tackle. It seems like she was very open, but it also felt like there were barriers.
Thank you for the question. Were there any barriers? No, there were people telling us, like, are you sure you want to keep that in the film? We showed it to a few people.
What?
Yes.
You said yes?
Yeah.
I don't know. Like about the husband? The what?
The husband.
Said she wanted to burn white people.
Yes, that's it.
What, saying she wanted to burn white people?
Yeah. Some people that we showed it to were like, well, are you sure you really think about this? It's too much. And I made my case to Bethann. I was like, this shows the intensity of the moment, and it shows your intensity in that moment, something that also you said with humor, and it's after the fact, and I think it's important for people to see that there's this other part to Bethann that can be activated, and it's completely honest, and I know the long story of why she wanted to put a couple white people, and and I have also that in the phone call. Talk about barrier. I didn't want to put that in the film because I think it was pretty clear that we don't want. It needs to be for what purpose? Incriminate a couple of people that did something that was not very thoughtful at some point. So Bethann was very. She listened to all the arguments, and then she was ready to keep it in.
And yes.
Hi. I guess I'm building on some of the other questions that have been asked, but
it's kind of a privileged position as the filmmaker to be in this kind of intimate, creative space with somebody like her. And I got the impression that, you know, by the end of the film, we're seeing this kind of deeper awareness of herself that she's gotten through this process, and kind of realizations that she's having about, you know, looking back in the long arc of her life and things like that. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about the process of being in that kind of, there's a kind of intimacy you have with her as the subject. I mean, yes, she's also co-directing with you, so you have that intimacy, but could you talk a little bit about that kind of process of what seems to be like an unfolding happening in her at this stage of her life?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's true. I think you're really putting your finger on something that is very deep, and part of the reason I asked Bethann to co-direct is to have that journey, that emotional journey with someone that I really respect and admire, and to get a little closer, and for her to also turn around and look back and realize what she's done. At some point, Dapper Dan, we were at lunch with Bethann, and he turned to me, he was like, "Do you realize, young man, how lucky you are?" And it was early in the shooting, and and Bethann was like, "Oh, stop it, Dan, Dapper, like he's not born yesterday." But the more I made this film and the more I interviewed everyone, the more I realized how lucky I was actually Bethann kept growing and growing in stature as I was making this film, as I was listening to everything she's done and how she's impacted. So by the end, that's why I was like terrified to show her. I was like, it's a big responsibility, this is a major figure, historical figure that we're telling the story of. So, but I think it's like, I wish she were here tonight because she would tell you like how much it's changed her life to hear what you all are saying about how her story resonates in the world. It really has made a big difference, and for her to sort of take the time to acknowledge that, and to so yeah, I think that's, as a filmmaker, you can really hope for a better outcome.
Yes, we have one question in the back, and then y'all gonna kick us out.
I was hesitant to talk because I feel so close to this. And thank you for what you've done. You've done an amazing job. I sat down with Bethann over 10 years ago and said, "This movie's about you." And she pushed back and said, "No, it's not about me." And I think what you did really shows how true that it is about her. And you mentioned it, but can you say a little bit more about like the moment that you got her to cross over and realize that it really was about her? And I think back to one thing, like you got her house so well. Like you go in that apartment, and the way you captured it is like, that's really what it is. This exact place. Can you say a little bit more about that? And also, I want to ask a question. This may be a cheat, but why is there no Morocco in the movie?
Bethann is in Morocco now. She didn't go while we were shooting. I mean, it's unfortunate. It was like the pandemic, and I think she took 1 year off from Morocco. She does every year usually, but we had great footage of her, archival footage of her on a tuk-tuk, kind of like going through this. But there was just a lot to pack into this film, so we felt like, Mexico had more. Even Mexico, I had to choose, because there are 2 houses in Mexico. We only show one. But, well, to answer your first question about like how, I don't think I was the only one to really tell her, like it needs to be about you. But for me, it was like beyond all the achievements in her life. I think her presence was like so unique that I felt like that was the thing to capture. And I told her, I was like, I had just made a film about Diana Vreeland, and she actually liked that film very much. That was her favorite of mine. And I told her, I was like, you really remind me of Diana Vreeland. Just the way you look at things is in this philosophical like lens, and with humor and unexpected and style. But the thing that's wonderful is that, you know, you're alive and we can film you and we can have hours of film. Because on the Diana Vreeland film, it was so, you know, there were just a handful of like TV appearances and archival footage, and that was a challenge. But so I thought it was wonderful that, you know, she was here and we could document her. Now was the time.
I can imagine you gifted her, you know, the ability to see herself differently. I think it's a beautiful film, so thank you for gifting it to us.
Thank you.
Thank you for